Okay. So, hello everyone. We're glad you're here. We're going to talk about survivor support today, but before we get started, I'll introduce myself. I'm Peggy Helton. I'm with TASA and the grant administrator on the ARPSA grant. And with me is Annette. She is the grant administrator of the SAPS grant. And Roger, who is in our finance department, and Tim, who is our leader. He is our director of grants. So we're all here today to go through survivor support and really kind of have a conversation about what it is and how we implement it. And so I'm going to just jump right in. Please know that you can put any questions you might have in the chat. Also, we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to quickly go through the intent of the grant. We're going to talk about what is survivor support. We're going to talk about what is allowable on each grant type because we have folks here today that are on different grants. So we're going to really talk about what's allowable on your grant. Talk about the reporting requirements for survivor support. And we'll talk about the client assistant tracking form, which is how you report on survivor support. And then we're going to talk about implementation. So how you implement this type of support to survivors. So first of all, just a reminder of the intent of the grant. And this is for FSA. So the intent of ARPSA is to assist sexual assault survivors by providing virtual services, supporting services, housing assistance, mobile advocacy services, and supplies that will ensure survivors receive the care, support, and services they need while reducing their exposure to the COVID-19 virus. And then the secondary intent is to support the increased emergency needs of survivors as a result of COVID-19. So the ARPSA grant is actually broken down by further focus areas in Texas. There are 4 focus areas, and I'm going to go through those quickly because it depends on which focus area you have as to what survivor support is allowable. So the first being enhanced remote services, so technology infrastructure to expand virtual services. Emergent survivor needs, and that is where survivor support comes in. So providing for those emergency needs of survivors, COVID-19 mitigation, which means emergency preparedness, items corporate crisis centers operate safely, in person, and to better support mitigation of COVID-19, and then mobile advocacy and partnerships, which really means to meet survivors where they are in community and serve survivors in places that they feel safe in their community. And Annette, I'm gonna hate to do this to you, but can you give us a brief kind of just summary of SAPS? Because my apologies, I did not put it on the screen.
Yeah, no problem. So SAP is a services grant. So basically, it's not contingent on COVID-19. It's been around for more years than that. But basically, the idea is to support the direct services to adult sexual assault survivors. And so that's why we have restrictions on the age that you serve, the fact that that it's not a domestic violence grant, and no prevention work, outreach is very minimal, that kind of thing. So this is basically to provide a direct service to survivors.
Thank you, Annette. So what is survivor support? So survivor support is relatively new to sexual assault programs and grants. We know that trauma and dealing with that trauma impacts survivors in lots of ways. So survivor support is meant to mitigate the impact of the assault in very concrete ways. So helping with rent, utilities, food, ID replacement, those emergency type expenses that really arise as a result of the assault. And so we really want to talk about survivor support today, provide additional information for you as grantees on how to implement these types. But we'll start with they include 3 budget line items that you're going to see on your budget. And the first one is supplies kept on hand.
Thank you for calling Abigail.
Supplies kept on survivors, items purchased for specific survivors, and third-party payments made on behalf of survivors. And so, like Annette said, really the focus on all the grants are survivors of sexual assault, going to be primarily adults. Some can provide services to teens and young adults. The age that you can start services depends on your grant as well. And so we're going to go through and let you know which services are provided for which grant. But if these 3 will appear on your budget, and collectively, they are what we call survivor support. And I'm going to go through just each one. So first, supplies kept on hand for survivors. So this is things that your agency might purchase that you want to keep on hand. Anything from journals that you give survivors for counseling to hospital accompaniment, survivor bags. You want to keep those receipts. That's really important on all survivor support, but you're not going to record them or report them on what we call a client assistance tracking form, where you will other types of survivor support. And we're going to talk about that later. So supplies kept on hand for survivors is allowable if you're an ARP-SA offering 1 grant, if you're and you have a focus area of emergent survivor needs or mobile advocacy and partnership grants, or ARP-SA offering 2 grants, or pilot projects, or SAPs. So if you have that type of grant, it is allowable for you to have supplies kept on hand for survivors. Again, it's a line item on your budget. So let's talk about items purchased for a specific survivor. This is where your staff will go out and you might purchase something and give it directly to a survivor. So like clothing or formula, breast pumps, groceries, those type of things. You also must keep receipts, but each transaction must be recorded on the client assistance tracking form. And we're going to talk more about that form. It's allowed on ARP-SA if you're offering 1, again, on the Emergent Survivor Need grant and also the Mobile Advocacy grants. If you are in offering 2, and if you're on the pilot project, or if you're a SAPS grantee. So let's talk about third-party payments on behalf of clients. Those are payments made to a third party on behalf of your client, made directly to the third party, and things like rent, deposits, clothing, car repairs, utilities, could be tires if your client needs to get an inspection and can't pass inspection. You can, it can be ID replacement, deposits, which is something that's not normally allowed on a grant. Again, must keep all receipts. Each transaction must be recorded on that client assistant tracking form. You're going to hear me mention that a lot. And it's allowed on ARPA offering one only on emergent survivor needs grants. So offering one got to choose which focus area that they were working on. So if they chose that some emergent survivor needs grant, this includes third-party payments. So also the pilot projects can do third-party payments in SAPS grantees. So here I just want to back up for a minute to kind of list some of the grant types so you can see yourself in a grant type. If you do not know what grant type you are, you can reach out to me if you know your ARPA, and then I can let you know. But if your grant started November 2022 and you were in offering one, if your grant started in April 2023, then you're in offering two. And if your grant started in October of 2023 or after, then you're one of our pilot projects. Or if you're the Sexual Assault Services Program pass-through grant. Now, I will tell you that the allowable expenses depend on the type of grant, and there is a wide range of items allowable under especially third-party payments. And there's probably too many to list here, but you can go to that link and TASA.org, get involved, announcements. It's going to give you all the grant announcements. So you can find your offering type, and in those grant announcements will be more information about third-party payments, emergent survival needs, what's allowable on your grant type. Makes sense? I'm going to go through a quick rundown for each grant type, but remember, you can get a lot more information in the announcements. So offering one is allowed emergent survivor needs. It cannot exceed $50,000. Also can do supplies kept on hand for survivors, items purchased for specific survivors, and third-party payments. So can have all three of those type of line item budgets. If you're an offering one and you have mobile advocacy and partnership grant, you can have supplies kept on hand for survivors. So as your advocates go out to the hospital, you can keep hospital bags on in your agency on hand, so when you need those. So offering two, you can keep supplies on hand for survivors, so you can purchase those. You can also purchase items for specific survivors. But third-party payments are not allowed with offering two grants. Then if you're one of our pilot projects, so you can do supplies kept on hand for survivors, can purchase items for specific survivors, can do third-party payments. You cannot, all three of those cannot exceed 10% of your yearly total grant award. If I start fast or you have questions, you just raise your hand or put something in the chat, because folks are monitoring the chat, and we can answer those questions. So if you're a SAPS grantee, you can have supplies kept on hand for survivors. You can purchase items for specific survivors, can do third-party payments, cannot exceed 10% of your total yearly grant award. And then you have further limitations on the types of support. And I put up the SAPS grant announcement, the link to the grant announcement, because you can find all of that in the grant announcement. I'm going to go through some of them for the SAPS. So you can replace like bedding, clothing, other household items if needed. You can secure new and temporary housing, including payment for a security deposit or first month's rent or moving expenses, if the survivor doesn't qualify for crime victims compensation. So that's an additional requirement. You can do travel expenses and childcare expenses and food, including culturally appropriate food, utility assistance, security measures like rekeying locks, replacing a cell phone, purchasing a motion detector, a security camera. What all these types of grants cannot pay for is installation expenses. So it, you can certainly purchase a security camera, cannot pay installation, and those are just requirements that are on federal grants. So if you have both an RFSA grant and a SAPS grant, just know that those allowable expenses can be different between grants. So I want to move on to what is allowable. So to be allowable, a cost must be related to the sexual assault. So example, after the assault, client missed work and was not able to pay rent. So that would be allowable under a third-party payment on behalf of survivor. Has to be necessary and reasonable. So, in the grant world for federal grants, it's what a prudent person would think is reasonable. That's what's in the requirements. That's what it says. Thing to remember is these grants are to meet emergency needs. And well, as we know that there are some things that would be great for recovery, it just might not be an allowable expense because of these restrictions. So it has to be necessary, reasonable. So is the item that you're thinking about purchasing, is it ordinary and necessary to meet the goals of the grant? The goals of the grant, again, tie back to you're meeting an emergency need of a survivor. So is the cost, does it comply with your cost principles and the federal award? Is there comparable market prices? Things like that. All these things are really to be thought through and taken into consideration as you're implementing this grant. Is it specific to the population that these grants really are designed to serve? And one thing I just want to say is, it does have to be consistent with the 2 CFR 200. And we also know that that's very broad, and necessary and reasonable may be confusing. So if you have any questions at all, if something is allowable, reach out to your grant administrator and we can walk you through the process of really determining is this an allowable expense? So beware of items that are not allowable. And again, I would say reach out. If you have any questions, reach out to your grant administrator. So Annette for SAPS and myself for RFSA to see if that expense is allowable or not. So anything that's not allowable under your 2 CFR 200 would not be able to do it on this grant. Cannot do cash payments to survivors at all, no gift cards or fuel vouchers. Entertainment costs are not allowable, including anything for amusement, social activities, or associated costs. And this, again, we know that there are some things that may be really helpful to recovery, but that are not allowable under these grant guidelines. And so just want folks to be aware of that. Food for meetings and groups is not allowable. Food, you can purchase food for clients for their home. That is definitely allowable, but cannot purchase food for meetings or groups. Gifts to clients are not allowable. and student activity costs. So costs to be in a student club or other student activities are also not allowable under this grant. And I would say either grants. Okay. So documentation and reporting, each one of these line items has a specific documentation and reporting. Supplies kept on hand for survivors. You want to keep all your documentation as you would for any other expenditure. So keep your receipts. You do not record these on your client assistant tracking form. Items purchased for specific survivors, third-party payments made on behalf of survivors. If you're doing these, you also need to keep all your documentation as you would for any other expenditure, but you do record each transaction on a client assistant tracking form. And it is a specific form that we send you, that you would record each transaction on that form. So I want to talk about that and go through it with you. So your client assistant tracking form is going to cover a year of expenses. So a year of your grant, which, you know, started again October. So you'll start capturing those expenses for the year. You will send it to us at the end of each quarter. But when you send us a copy, you just keep using that same form for the rest of the year. It will ask you for the following information. It will ask you for a client ID. You'll never ever send us anything that has a client name on it or that can identify a client. It needs to be a unique client ID that only you know how to align the client ID with your client. You'll have that information. We'll just have the client ID. It'll be the date that you bought the item or paid the third party and the cost of that and the description. So along with the description, like if you said you paid rent, then you would need to put the vendor, who you paid or who you bought the item from. So if it's a landlord's name, you want to say if it's an individual landlord, if you're paying an individual, if they're property management, if it's an apartment complex, put the name of the apartment complex. Make sure you identify exactly who you paid on behalf of the client and who, if you're purchasing something for a client, like you go to Walmart and you are buying clothes for a client, then Walmart would go under the description. We are seeing forms come in without the vendor, and so we absolutely have to have the vendor in the description. And then you want to write what the impact on the client was. And this really gives you an opportunity to show why it was an emergency purchase, right? So the client was in, you know, they might have lost their home if you hadn't paid rent, or they might have lost their car, which is their only way to go to work if you did not pay the car note. So this is really to talk about the impact of client, any context that you can give on, you know, those expenditures were allocated. And I'm moving pretty fast, so I'm going to stop here for just a second, see if anybody might have any questions. Anything in the chat, Tim? Okay, so implementation, how do we go about doing it? So first you want to develop a plan and to answer the questions of who, why, who, what, when, and how. So why, what purpose of your survivor support? Do you have a specific type of emergency need that you feel like you need to prioritize? What is the greatest need? How flexible can you be? How will you ensure the funds are distributed in an equitable manner? So what are your boundaries around these funds? For both ARP and SAPS, the federal funds, the federal funders really want to ensure that the funds are distributed equitably and they're distributed efficiently so that the maximum amount of survivors can benefit from these funds. So they want to make sure that the funds are not going to like one survivor. They want to see it spread and the impact over survivors. You want to think about who's eligible for your survivor support and what is your eligibility criteria. And really for this, I would encourage you to look back on the certifications of the funding announcement because for ARPA, there's non-discrimination information in there. So services must be provided without requiring documentation of immigrant status. There's also requirements for participating in services. So services cannot depend on if a client seeks counseling or if a client seeks a substance abuse or if they take a specific legal remedy for their case. So all of that is in your grant announcement. So I'd encourage you to look through it. For SAPS, there's certain accessibility requirements related to provision of services to persons who are limited in their English, also accessible to persons with disabilities. So when you're thinking about like who's eligible, you want to think about those other requirements of the grant that would impact your policy on who might be eligible. So the what kind of survivor support is your agency going to provide? Again, what's the most need? How do you ensure it goes to the folks with the most need? When you're going to provide this support? So is there a time frame? So how long are you going to provide the support for each survivor? And again, thinking about the impact of this grant, the intent of this grant is that for those emergency needs. So how long is that? What does that look like to you? And then how your agency is going to purchase items for survivors. How will you get those items to the survivor? Who will make the third-party payments on behalf of the survivor? And so next you want to write down your plan in an agency policy because to do survivor support, to have that available survivors, you must have a policy and procedures that really ensure equal and fair access to these funds. And so write down your policy, and is your policy transparent not only to your staff, but also to survivors? And then when you send the client assistant tracking form, you'll also send us your policies because one of the important things to the funders, to the federal funders, is that if you have a policy, you're distributing those funds according to your policy. Okay. And then you want to take a look at the client assistant tracking form. You want to review that, make sure that you know what documentation that you need to keep before you purchase these things so that you can have that information readily available and so you can fill out that client assistant tracking form. And so I'm going to stop for questions. I know that was a lot of information. So questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to put questions in the chat.
Peggy, you did a really good job of this, but I just wanted to kind of remind folks again, like that description section of that client tracking form is really important. Like I tell folks this all the time, like think of yourself like an auditor, like while you're reviewing the document, and if anything feels like it might be like it's kind of a unique situation, like use that description section not only to give us the vendor and a description, but that's also where you can say like, give us enough, if it's kind of a unique situation that helps us understand, what might be the case. If you're buying like a whole bunch of groceries or like groceries, twice in the same day, like anything that kind of looks a little unique, then you can use that description section to kind of give us a little bit of information about what that is, what's going on in that situation.
Yes, provide as much context as you can. And again, also reach out. If you have a unique client situation, and wondering, well, can we purchase this for this client? Reach out and we'll have a conversation about it. It's better to do that than, it being an unallowable expense and you not knowing it or not realizing it. That makes sense.
I'd also like to reinforce what Peggy said about keeping your original grant announcement as a reference on a lot of these things, because I know on the SAS grant, page 10 will pretty much tell you everything you need to know. And then at the bottom of page 18, it also explains that it must be related to the sexual assault. So this is not an anti-poverty grant. For example, if somebody had, 4 car payments before they were sexually assaulted, you can't go in and on a SAS grant and pay 4 months worth of car payments to keep their car from being repossessed, because a lot of those problems preceded their sexual assault. So just, make sure that you can somehow relate it to their victimization. Like Peggy was talking about earlier, tires for their car, or they can't go to work, so they need to have their utilities paid for the month, or that kind of thing. This is not to make people whole. That's a terrible way to put it, but when they look at it, they're not going to say, and somebody audits those things, they're not going to say, oh, well, this person needed all these kinds of things. It doesn't matter if it wasn't related somehow to the assault that they experienced. So narratives are really important.
And I'll also echo Annette with ARP-SA, different offerings are the allowable expenses are going to be on different pages. So I can't tell you the pages, but look back on that, because there is a lot of flexibility to it. There's a lot of things that might be allowable that I didn't mention here. So it gives you a really good idea. I think the thing to remember with ARP-SA is that it is called Emergent Survivor Needs. It is for that emergency to help mitigate, again, the effects of that assault. So any questions, though, on whether something might be allowed, just definitely reach out. So question, are the slides available? Yes. We're also recording, so, we'll, as soon as we get the recording back, there's a few-day process to that. We'll send out the link to the recording and also the slides at the same time.
Peggy, if I can just add the accounting part, that do document these expenses in the correct budget categories in your accounting records, and also be mindful that these are federal expenses. So have good checks and balances, the good internal controls when you're spending this money. Thank you.
And one thing I think I forgot to say is any expenses does need to be in this grant year. So it can't be before the grant started. The day that you purchase the item or you pay for a third party, it has to be in this grant year. Thanks, Roger, too. Anything else?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes,
I just wanted to make sure that the client assistance tracking form, that it's due quarterly and not yearly.
yes, correct. It's gonna capture your expenditures for a year, but you'll send it to us quarterly. So I think we just have asked for them now, so at the end of the third quarter, you'll send them again, and it'll be everything that you had up till that date, and at the end of the year, you'll send it again, and, you'll be adding the fourth quarter
Why
to
is we doing this? No change.
it.
Sorry, what was that?
Did that answer your question, Amanda?
Yes, yes, Peggy, thank you so much. So it's gonna be a cumulative thing then,
It
right?
will be on your end. You'll send it to us quarterly, but it will be a cumulative.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think I was a little confused on that, but I've got it now.
okay.
Okay. All right, thank you so much.
Uh-huh. Ruby, you are unmuted. Did you have a question?
No, ma'am.
Okay, then with your permission, okay, thank you. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, if nobody has any more questions, we can give back part of the day, right? It's always a good thing. And just know you can reach out to us at any time with any questions about this or anything else that has to do with your grant. We really appreciate you taking your time to be here today and learn more about this, because it is really new for grantees to be able to provide this service, and we're really glad that it's available in both of the grants, so. Thanks so much. Anything else, Annette or Tim or Roger? Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.